Um, Good evening, everyone. I am Celia Maria Blendan, member of the Fulbright Association of South Florida chapter, and it's a true pleasure to welcome you to this special edition of our Fulbright Association Speaker Series. Make AI work for you. Practical tools to help you thrive in the age of AI, artificial intelligence. As you may know, the Fulbright Association is the alumni arm of our nation's oldest and largest international exchange program. We represent 140,000 U.S. alumni and 54 chapters around the country. If you are a Fulbright alum in the South Florida area, I encourage you to join them. I'm the treasurer, so just reach out to me and to Leland as well. Recently, we started a Fulbright speaker series that embodies the Fulbright mission, fostering international understanding through thoughtful dialogue, innovation, and collaboration. Last month, we had an impactful virtual discussion about fostering health and wellness during Mental Health Awareness Month. Tonight, discussion is part of our continued effort to spotlight critical issues that shape our world. And few topics today are as transformative or as complex as artificial intelligence. Now, without further delay, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Donovan Johnson, professor at the FIU School of International and Public Affairs, which has graciously sponsored this event. And by the way, I am proud to be a Fulbrighter.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. There we go. I'm Donovan Johnson. I'm a professor here at Florida International University. And incidentally, I'm also the Associate Director for the Center for Integrated Security, Privacy, and Trustworthy AI here at FIU. It is my pleasure indeed to move these remarks on behalf of our Dean, Dean Dinar, and by extension, the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. It's a true pleasure to welcome you all to the Green School for what promises to be, I see astute speakers here sitting, for what promises to be an insightful and dynamic program that the Fulbright Association has in store for you this evening. As a Fulbright scholar myself, fortunately, I'm especially pleased and humbled to share in this occasion, which seeks to drive dialogue on an issue that is crucial to global governance and the lives and livelihoods of peoples all across the world. No doubt, especially at a time like this, Fulbright is living up to its fundamental mission, which is to advance knowledge across communities and improving the lives of people in the process. AI and its applications are evolving by the minute, dare I say by the second. At FIU, we recognize how quickly the landscape is shifting, and our faculty remains steadfast in researching its applications and potentials in exploring its many uses. Here at the Green School, our teams are actively discussing how AI can inform and enhance their work. Just 2 weeks ago, for example, the Center for the Administration of Justice, one of the schools and centers under the Green School, hosted a session focused on how AI and structural analysis are being used to model interactions among criminal networks, corruption structures, and victimization patterns. Truly life changing work. Even more, our faculty members are researching the impact of AI on public service delivery, for example, uh, and on the lives and livelihoods of people, and more urgently and more pointedly, on democracy and democratization. Earlier this year, the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy convened key stakeholders in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., to tackle some of the most pressing issues related to AI proliferation in governance and the economy. These tools are they not only help to enhance institutional accountability, but also to inform policy responses and support evidence based advocacy. FIU is a hub for innovation, and the Fulbright Association has chosen a perfect place to hold this event. We are very excited to have you, and on behalf of the Dean, thank you for being here. And now it is my pleasure to turn over the floor, the dais, to Aaron. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you very much, and thank you to Leland for inviting us and organizing this conversation. Very briefly, my name is Aaron Rosen. I serve as the president and founder of the World Affairs Council of Miami. We are a 501c3 nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that serves to educate the public here in South Florida about international affairs topics. It is my pleasure to moderate today's conversation, which will serve not only as a resource for those here in the room, but as a resource for the National Fulbright Associations Network. And so we're very hopeful, and we will do our best to make sure this is a valuable resource for many across the country. With that, I think that sometimes you can introduce your speakers, or sometimes you can ask them to share a bit about who they are and where they've come from to get to where they are today. And so we'll dive right into it and get started. To begin, I'd ask each of you to briefly describe your current work in the AI space, but specifically starting from what first drew you into the field, looking at your Fulbright experiences. So Nadia, you had applied to do your Fulbright at Georgetown University. Unfortunately, that was canceled because of the pandemic.
Right.
Emmanuel, you did your Fulbright in the United Kingdom, focused on robotics. I'm curious if you could both share, perhaps starting with you, Emmanuel, here to my left, and then working over to you, Nadia, how the Fulbright experiences that you had, or the one that you plan to have, impacted the work you do today, and how that connects to the field of artificial intelligence and how we can make it work for you, those here in the room, and those in the audience. So please, Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you, Aaron. And first and foremost, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I think it's a very critical time that we're having this conversation around AI. As Aaron said, my name is Emmanuel Dorley. I'm a professor in the School of Computer Science at the University of Florida, where my work explores how do we leverage AI to improve education. And that traditionally means thinking about how virtual agents can be used to not only serve as a role-playing partner for you to practice different skills, but also serve as a tutor that supports you as you learn. And one of the reasons why, that has always been sort of my interest is, and how it connects to my Fulbright experiences. I went to North Carolina A&T undergrad, and just being on the campus and sort of being in this, being at a HBCU and being in a space that, really sort of helps support and help us think about not only the technical abilities that we're developing, but also how it affects society, I think was a sort of a good grounding. And so throughout undergrad, I've always been interested in technology and robotics. And I remember as a sophomore, I went to a conference and this guy had a robot. And, he was talking to the robot and he said, the robot gave him instructions and said, raise your left hand. And he raised his right hand and the robot was like, wrong hand. And I was like, whoa, how does the robot even know? And so it was that point that really sort of sparked my interest in robotics. But as I was finishing up undergrad, I was thinking about where did I really want to go and where I wanted to take my work. And so at the time, the UK was one of the few places that had a robotics master's program that didn't require you to speak another language. And so it was an easy sell for me. And I think it was during, of course, I had exposure to the field of AI in undergrad, but it was during the master's, which I pursued through my Fulbright, that I really got a bit of a deeper understanding of AI and robotics, and also what it could be applied to. And then also being in the UK gave me a very global perspective on what's happening, because in our class, since you have students from all over the world, tackling the question of what can technology do. And so what I learned from there is that one, is not only just about the technology, but it's the human aspect. And so that has really driven the work that I've done. And I've primarily tried to focus on these use-inspired direction of AI work, not just creating models improving models for the sake of improving them, but thinking about what are the real tangible outcomes that we want to address in society that AI can help us with. So I think that Fulbright experience was very instrumental in sort of shaping the way I look at technology, I look at my career, and I look at AI now.
Thank you very much. Nadia, what about you?
Yeah, I think we come from similar veins in terms of education in that way. And although I didn't complete a Fulbright because of the pandemic, my work was on technology enhanced assessment. And so looking at different ways in which you can engage with technology, what does that look like? And some of you in the room, you can really appreciate when you're in a post-secondary or K-12 environment, assessment is the rawest thing for you. It's where you think you got it or you didn't. And then sometimes you have the feedback in which you can understand how to build your competencies and develop and attain the goals that you want to. And sometimes, unfortunately, you don't. And so that was the exploration around it. I've continued to do that research, though, in the technology-enhanced space in terms of AI and other types of modalities. Because it's important for us to really help individuals understand how to assess, how to give feedback, how to engage in like a growth process, and how to support students because they think differently now. They have different motivations, and there are different ways in which traditional teaching doesn't work. And so that's kind of the space I inhabit.
And for both of you, how did you initially come to learn about the Fulbright opportunity?
Okay, so I do a lot of philanthropic work, and I also have a consulting company on the side. And so my work is very international. As I'll share later, I do a lot of work in the Caribbean and Haiti, and I'm from Trinidad originally. And so it's just a natural place to engage with. And because I try to make a difference, and also because of my privilege, I take the lever in society and start moving change. It was a way to look at what opportunities were out there. And I'm a practitioner, I would say I'm a practitioner scholar and scholar practitioner in the more modern sense of it. And so I feel that my work at times through, sorry, I said I wasn't going to touch my scarf. My work at times through industry and digitization and everything else really does level education because learning is the root of everything, actually.
Thank you very much. And we'll definitely dive into some of that in greater detail. Emmanuel, what about you? How did you hear about Fulbright initially? When you saw the robot interact with the man's hand, how did you know, not just that this is what I want to look into, but that Fulbright is the avenue for it?
So I think as I was finishing up undergrad, I wanted to continue down this route in robotics, but at the time I knew vaguely about the Fulbright program, but I didn't know too much. And at the time, we had a new chancellor who was very interested in getting students to engage in these international scholarships. And at the time, A&T had not had a Fulbright winner. And so somebody from the scholarship and fellowship office reached out and said, hey, I think your profile may be a good fit for this program. Do you want to apply? And I was like, man, this is prestigious. I don't know if I could compete. You know, nobody else has done it. There's no sample application. But I said, you know what? I have nothing to lose. You know, worst case, I don't get it, and I'm in the same position. And so at the time, the scholarship and fellowship person was Miss Anna Whiteside, and so she really sort of brought me in, taught me what I needed to do in terms of applying, and that's what led me to apply for Fulbright. But yeah, I didn't have a preconceived notion that I was going to apply for the Fulbright early on. It was somebody else that saw something in me and encouraged me to apply for the award.
And then let you be a trailblazer then.
Exactly.
Very cool, very cool. Before we kind of move toward the present and start also looking into the future, I'd like to take the opportunity to, while I have both of you here, to outline for those listening in or those here in the room at the moment, the kind of contemporary historical development of AI. So from its very humble origins, maybe in the mid-20th century to kind of where we are now, where artificial intelligence is coming seemingly to dominate nearly every aspect of both our personal and professional lives. How did we get to where we are here if we can trace kind of a narrative of historical and technological evolution with regard to AI? Maybe if you want to start first, Emmanuel, and then we'll look over at you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, nowadays when people talk about AI, they often make it sound as if it's this new thing that just came out of nowhere. You know, it's often this sort of magical feel to it. But the field's been around for, I would say, close to 100 years now. You know, we often trace the field back to Alan Turing's initial paper, essentially asking the questions, can machines think? And so what he concluded there was this notion of thinking isn't really the question we want to tackle. It's more so, you know, if we want to, you know, create something that's useful, we should try to mimic what humans do. And so the idea behind the Turing test was if you can build a machine that can interact with a person, and at the end of that interaction, that person can't tell whether or not it's a human or a machine interacting with them, then in some sense we have an intelligent system. And so there was this view that humans were the proxy for what intelligent was. And so over the years, we've sort of leveraged that to then tackle different problems. So in the early days, we started with chess and board games because those are what quote unquote intelligent people did. Now, one of the challenges that we had, and if, for example, if you look at a chess playing system, chess is what we call a deterministic game. At the end of the day, there's only a set number of moves you can make. So it's a much smaller problem. And the reason why we started there is we didn't have the compute power, we didn't have the data, right? But as we've grown and computer processing speeds have gotten faster, that has made it possible for us to process a larger amount of data. And if you look at the world in the last 20 years, we've generated massive amount of data to the point where the amount of data that's been generated maybe in the last 5 years is probably greater than all the data generated in history prior to that time, just to give you a sense of the skill. And that skill in data and in compute power has made many of the innovations happen that we have now. Now, most of these algorithms aren't new. They've been around since the 70s and 80s. It's just now this increase in processing power coupled with this increase in data has made those things possible. And so that's why we're seeing more adoption, we're seeing more applications, we're seeing more use cases than we did 20, 30 years ago. But many of the same ideas that people had in the 70s and 80s are what we're realizing now.
Nadia, anything to add to
Yeah,
that?
I'll just add to the idea of natural language processing and LLMs. In this case, this is that new avenue of seeing where AI evolves in some regard. If you look at the earlier technology, you'd see it in transportation, aerospace, things like that, where it was easier for them to automate and do functions that were more rote and, I guess, algorithmic in nature. But one of the things that we're seeing now is the data that we are harnessing. It's kind of like that. We have lots of data, but it could be poor data too. And so the implications of that are such that some of the things that we're seeing in the outputs of generative AI in particular are ones in which we do need to be skeptical. And I know you're going to talk about hallucinations, so I'm not going to take that away from you. But I do think we need to see that some of the domains and fields that AI was in was not relatively impactful as it is now in education and other spaces where large language model and applications are a little bit more universal. And so that skepticism that you're seeing in the populace and I call it a hodgepodge of adoption, is not the same as how you saw it in industry. They are two different factors of the evolution of AI.
Question, was there a particular year where, let's say, Emmanuel, you outlined the two variables, right? The amount of data available and the processing computing power. Was there a particular breakthrough year that both sort of aligned for AI to take kind of a transformative leap in its ability to be used at scale?
I think a lot of the innovations we're seeing now came from the early 2010s. And it was when we realized so in most of your computers, you have a CPU, which is a central processing unit, and you have a GPU, which is a graphical processing unit. So the GPUs is typically what creates all those nice visuals and makes makes gameplay more realistic. And so it was around that time that people realized, oh wow, you know what? These GPUs can actually be used for traditional computation, and they started to then apply that to various problems. And at that time, I think we had, you had things like YouTube that was a bit more mature. Google, as a search engine, was more mature, and we had a lot more data being generated from social media and just more people being online. And so I think those two things combined in the 2010s really helped sort of set the stage for what we see today in the field of deep learning.
Got it. So I think that's very helpful to your point, setting the stage. What I want to do now is ask for both of you to chime in on this next aspect of the conversation, which is helping the audience to understand the kind of theoretical grounding of artificial intelligence. And sort of to help kind of the foundational understanding of what AI can and cannot do. These days, it seems that AI can do most everything, right? From passing your exams for you, whether it's easy exams or med exams, right? To detecting cancer years in advance, to being your personal assistant and everything in between, right? At a foundational level, and Emmanuel, I'll start with you here. What can AI, with its current abilities, actually do and not do? If we think of like debunking some kind of common myths, right? The AI is omnipresent and can do everything and is everywhere, versus like where the technology actually is based on the current foundational principles of artificial intelligence. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stories being. I think there's a brilliant marketing being done by a lot of companies in terms of selling up the hype. The reality is when we look at what AI is doing is taking it has some mapping, right? You have a large amount of data, right, that you've trained these systems on across a wide range of topics. And it's based on that knowledge base that is generating all of this answers and responses. And so that's part of the reason why we see some of these issues that we see with these systems, because it is limited to the information that it has. And so in terms of what AI can do, is really going to depend on how good and the quality of the data. And then there's just certain things that don't have that nice one-to-one mapping where you say, hey, this is exactly how this phenomenon shows up in data. So for example, when you're dealing with students and humans in general, humans are very non-deterministic, where you might think, hey, this person is bound to do this, they might do something else. So in those very deterministic space where we have enough data of, hey, here's how somebody has done this, right? And we know for sure that the data coming out matches that, then we can do really good work in AI. So for example, if you have you have a good road, you can have a self-driving car on that road and it's able to sort of navigate much easily. But when you put it in, let's say, a lot of different terrains, right? Uncharted roads, for example, that may be problematic. Or if you put it amongst kids who this system wasn't trained with their data in mind, it might break down. And so I think the limits of this technology is really dependent on the quality of the data, as well as the data that's being reflected in the systems that we build.
And I'll extend that a little bit. Part of this is also just that AI literacy space. So that idea that you need to actually know what AI is, and specifically what generative AI is, for being used in a kind of organic as well as objective way. And the average user does not know that. And so the idea that these tools are given to the grand populace and they're expected to know how to prompt, how to logically, prescribe different instructions, what the data is going to give out or the output to it, and then to critically analyze whether that output is fair and erroneous, whatever you call it. The general populace actually doesn't have that. We don't have that unless we train ourselves. And the other piece of that is when you look at the data mapping, it's kind of like a decision tree. There's a million decision trees going on at once. They're looking at this A, B, C, D, E, and they're considering what some of the possibilities are to it. Logically, as humans, we can't, formulate terabytes of information or data at one point in time, and that's what these machines do. But there is a downfall to it, which is the idea that they do, and then I'm going to segue back to you, they do give misinformation. And because we live in a world where we assume that what we Google or what we put in, which lots of people use AI as a Google platform, that it's all fair and it's all true, this is where we have to be critical consumers of this technology and really think about what is the information that it's giving to us. And so that idea of hallucinations, which I know you want to talk about, is a really important facet to these types of AI tools that are out there, and I'll segue to you.
Yeah, and I think what we call hallucination basically is you ask it for an answer, it gives you an answer that's just not right, right? And you ask yourself, well, why is that? As Nadia mentioned, the problem here is that it is making these decisions based on the data it has. So if the data it has is bad, then it's going to, the output is going to be bad. And so part of the challenge is, and why you've seen methods like Retrieval-Augmented Generation, or RAG, being developed, is so that we can at least be able to constrain what these systems can talk about. Because imagine you had a teacher who was trained off of every response on the internet, right? Some of those responses are good, some responses are bad. If we go on social media right now, if you look on any post,
Yeah.
there's one set of group that's going to argue one thing, another group is going to argue the other thing.
Yeah.
So if you have an agent that's trained on both perspectives,
Yeah.
how is it supposed to reason about which is right or wrong? Because we don't, oftentimes these agents aren't taught what is the right response from this data, right? And so it's making that judgment on its own.
Yeah.
And so what's happening when we see these hallucinations is saying, this is my best guess, given my knowledge base of what it is that you want.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the challenge with
Yeah.
what we see with hallucination.
And I'll come back to it in a little bit in the conversation, but I think also just the aspect of determining what is the right answer within those data sets is interesting and controversial, and some of the thorniest political and ethical elements of this conversation. I think that on this point, with regard to hallucinations, I think a recommendation for the audience might be like, when you encounter, if you're using, let's say, ChatGPT, if you encounter an error, it might be an interesting thought experiment to basically interrogate ChatGPT over that error and ask it how it came up with that error, why it did, and it'll give you answers about data sets and what it's been fed. And I think it's interesting, and I've done that myself, like when you do encounter an error that you know objectively, like it misclassifies a language in a different language group, right? That's an objective erroneous statement. You can interrogate it and watch how it responds to you and watch how it addresses its own falsehoods. And I think that's really interesting and a good lesson to know that, like, these are tools. They are not gods, right? And they are not giving you the perfect truth all the time. So I think that's very interesting, and I would definitely encourage anybody listening in to be an active user, not a passive user in that sense.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a bit of a slippery slope, though, when we talk about this and you interrogated the bot or whatever it was, the large language model that you used. You have knowledge, you have degrees, you have all of that. The average user does not have all that background knowledge, and they're certainly not transferring that knowledge in a way. So when I say a slippery slope, we have to consider that people don't always have the information that they're putting in or asking for an output. And so saying, and we do this in sort of the token AI literacy, we say, critically analyze the outputs. Well, that's fine if you have the knowledge to critically analyze and the tools to be able to do that. But sometimes you just don't have that. So that's why the majority of users take the outputs at face value. The other piece of this is we live in a world that is very binary, if you want to use that sort of analogy. And so, like you said, there's a perspective to the left, there's a perspective to the right, but actually life is the gray. It really is always. And so part of this that we do as researchers and as practitioners is we look at human in the loop. So that idea that the human is going to be the one that in some ways, air quotes, controls the machine and engages with that machine and creates the parameters, as well as some of the safeguards that would be used in order to utilize the tools. The other piece of this that the average person does not understand is there are corporations dedicated to making sure that the AI responses and outputs are not malicious in any way. And we don't think about that, to be honest with you. And these are nations around the world, typically developing nations, that are paid in different ways in lower cost structures, and they're actually trying to retrain the models when they're doing things that are nefarious. And again, it's an awareness, and Fulbright represents that idea of international understanding and that idea of diplomacy and the ability to bridge gaps. And so knowledge is really power in this space, and AI literacy is so important, and we encourage you to think about what are the GPTs that you're using? Why are you using them? What is the difference between, let's say, ChatGPT and Llama and all of those things? Like, you need to know that, be aware of it, and inform yourself, because for a human in the loop to happen, you have to be the driver of the processes that you engage with technology.
Nadia, and I want to actually follow that into the education sector. So, you have background looking at the intersection of technology, leadership, education, data science, and how these things impact, K through 12 and higher education in different markets. You've looked at Caribbean markets, you've looked at Canada, presumably the US as well. I was wondering how, in a nutshell, you think AI can, there are certainly these challenges to navigate or warnings that need to be conveyed, but how can AI pose a positive value for both educators and teachers. Educators and students.
Right.
And specifically, let's think about streamlining educational research. Let's talk about just improving efficiencies in your workflow so you can take on more.
For sure.
Even generating content itself, right? And the ethical considerations of that. How do you see positive use of AI? How can we make AI work for you in the education system and sector specific?
Absolutely. So I'll talk about accounting first and then talk about education. In a previous life, I used to do accounting for small and medium-sized firms and agriculture. And so some of my research is in accounting, to be honest with you. And so we interviewed the top 5 global firms in the world 2 years ago. And we asked them, where do you see AI? What are you moving to? What are some of your policies and some of your infrastructure that you're engaging in? And part of the conversation was around rudimentary tasks. So things that anyone can do, calculative tasks, debits and credits, being able to know what's on a cost list, what your assets are worth, the valuation, things like that. And so what they said was, we used to have 3 base level accountants doing a lot of this manual data collection and evaluation. Now AI can just synthesize that, and we're able to move on to more predictive financial consulting or coaching and things like that. So AI elevates the ability excuse me, to streamline workflow. It reduces rudimentary tasks, and it allows for predictive approaches. I'm going to hand it to you just because I have to cough.
Yeah, no. I think AI in education, AI education is something that's very, very personal to me. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how do we make sure it works for everybody? And so for me, I was born in Liberia during the height of the Civil War. I came to the U.S. as a refugee. Went to HBCU, and now I'm at one of the flagships university here in Florida.
You were going to say the flagship.
I'll give it that.
I heard it.
But so when I think about it and I look at those experiences, I think you find smart people through that entire pipeline. And so how do we leverage technology to ensure that each student, no matter what their background is getting that support that they need? If you have all the money in the world, perhaps you get your kids a tutor, but there are people who may not. And I think AI can play that role of providing that personalized education by essentially, leveraging that vast amount of data that it has to then be able to help guide students and help them think through, different problems. So that's really how I sort of think about the AI in the education space and ways in which AI can enhance education.
Yeah, and from the teacher perspective as well. So most teachers' workflow includes lesson planning, marking copious amounts of evaluations and assessments, as well as doing some long-range planning and application. And so what AI does is it allows them to make more inclusive lesson plans. It allows them to personalize across student populations, and it allows the students to be active in their learning. And so we're not there yet. Lots of K-12 school districts do not have policies, nor does corporate, to be honest with you. We really are in the infancy of this technological advancement, and much of the policies are a little bit reactive right now when it comes to privacy and things like that. And so I think what the audience should sort of take away is the idea that with massive amount of data, you can process, evaluate, and synthesize. Now, those used to be higher levels of cognition or thinking. So we'd say, let's recall and understand your information and maybe memorize a little bit so that you can spit it out on a test. Well, now with AI, you don't need to do any of that. You can move up to the higher levels of a cognitive taxonomy, so you can synthesize and evaluate. The deeper question to this, though, is the benefits to anyone who's just learning. That's the biggest question here. So we live in a world where we go A plus B equals C at times. Let's just use that linear example. But if A plus B is missing all the other letters to, let's say, Z, and you're inputting all of this into a machine, there is something that you're not internalizing and deeply learning that is missing. And so the broader question really is, what is the impact, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? How does education have to shift? Not only in K to 12, but in post-secondary. If you all can sit in those courses, and I do see some post-secondary students here, and you could have learned this all from doing your own inputs into AI and gathering your own information, then really what is the point of our institutions? And I'll share this with you. I believe the point of our institution is to develop citizens of tomorrow. Our point of our institutions is to help the world be a better place. This sounds cliche, but this is the truth of it, because these machines allow us to think differently. It allows us to be, air quotes, more creative, because we don't have to do some of the things that we used to have to do to manifest it into creativity. And so these are some of the benefits that any of the tools that exist can do. What we really need to learn is how to prompt engineer. The best people who have that deductive and inductive reasoning, which allows for creating questions and frameworks for the GPT to work, they will be the best suited to leverage the tools more than individuals, and we like to call it that use vanilla prompts. So they just copy and paste questions and they paste it in, and they expect the answer to be robust. And so when we think about this, it's your ability to critically think, and it's your ability to ask good questions that will really save the day.
I think that's a fascinating point, and I think that that also opens up a little bit of like a secret, which is that to ask a good question, you also have to understand the topic, right? And that goes to the point of like, you have to already be learning to understand the context in which you're asking your questions, right? The better you understand the content, the more accurately and with greater precision you can ask that question, the more valuable a response you're going to get, right? And so I think that's like a very key takeaway, and an argument for still like a liberal arts and broad-based education to give you a very strong and broad foundation from which you can dive into deeper degrees of subject matter expertise, right?
Absolutely, well
so
said.
I think that's an excellent point. Thank you, very interesting. Emmanuel, I want to pivot a little bit, just a little bit, to more softer interpersonal skills and how AI can help there. In your research, you've looked at how AI can help people boost their skills, and you've particularly looked at negotiation.
Right.
How can one use AI to better prepare themselves to navigate interpersonal situations, academic context, the workplace, maybe just interpersonal situations in their personal life, the ability to negotiate for what you're looking for, and the ability to kind of get ahead in life? How can AI help you do that?
Yeah, I think similar to what was said earlier, we have these tools that have a vast amount of knowledge, and they're really good at role playing. And so the crux behind my work was, when you think about what we often teach in schools, and especially in engineering, there's a huge focus on the technical skills. The problem is, when you get into the real world, you're not just working on technical problems. You're often working amongst and within teams that bring people from various backgrounds. And oftentimes, as an engineer, you may be sort of the person designing the technology, but you often have to communicate and interact with other people. And what you found is that, especially for computer science graduates, they're really good with the technical abilities, but they often don't have that interpersonal skills and the ability to navigate and manage conflict. And so one of the things that AI can allow you to do is it can act as a role-playing partner for you to practice some of these skills, and then it can give you feedback. So a lot of my work is, how do we design these agents to be very realistic in terms of how they negotiate with you, and then what types of automated feedback can we give you about the things that you negotiate over. So for example, in a traditional negotiation course, they teach you a bunch of principles, you practice with other students, and then maybe the professor looks at the negotiation of the class and gives you feedback on some people that did really well and others that didn't do so well. But what about the people in the middle who needs more of that coaching, right? This personalized system could be something that you practice at home in the comfort of your house, and are able to get really good and very specific feedback in terms of things that you're missing. And so I see it more so as a way for us to simulate that other person that you need in many of these interactions to learn certain skills.
Thank you very much. I want to, because we're slowly running, we have a little more time for some questions, but I want to get to also some questions from the audience. There's a couple things I want to jump at real quick before we open up for Q&A. One is, and we alluded to it earlier, the ethical elements of not just responsible AI use, so from the user side, but also from the governance and programming side. We had discussed previously determining within large data sets what is correct and incorrect information. What happens if you're talking about a war or a diplomatic situation or an election? How do you work to determine what is right or wrong in AI? Where are the rules around that? And then on the user side, how do we look at the intersection of, let's say, AI and traditional copyright, for example,
Right.
AI and intellectual property, AI and ownership, right? Or do we need to update some of our concepts of ownership in the same way that Napster and other, file-to-file, peer-to-peer sharing softwares made us do 20, 30 years ago? How do you see, let's say, maybe Emmanuel from a governance side and then Nadia from a user side, but feel free to take the
Yeah, I
alternative.
might do a governance side
Absolutely,
as well.
yeah.
Yeah, and I really like that you started in the sort of the music space because driving here, one of the things that I realized there was this album I used to listen to, and one of the songs is removed, and I imagine it's because of something related to copyright. And I think about 20 years ago, if I bought a CD, whether that artist got sued, that music is always with me, right?
Because you bought it.
Exactly, I own that, and I think it changed the nature of what it means to listen to music, right? Because in both good and bad ways, right? So with streaming platforms now, artists had less worry about somebody copyrighting their song or stealing their music, right? But now you sort of change the whole dynamic of ownership, and I think it's a similar sort of shift that we're going to see in AI. I often think of what Sherry Turkle said. When you think about technology, all technology is doing is amplifying human nature. So many of the thorny problems we had prior to AI are just being magnified by AI. This question of what is right or wrong, right? If you look at history, typically history has been written by the victor. And so in many cases, those narratives change depending on who writes it, right? So now when you add AI into this mix, it just means that whatever these inequities were, you can essentially automate and speed them up or amplify them. And so I think what needs to be done is sort of us taking that step back and really thinking about these social issues, thinking about these problems that existed before AI. And I think the one thing I really want everybody to sort of to get across is that we are the creators of this AI, right? It's not this magic thing that only OpenAI can do or only Google can do. We as everyday people can still contribute to the development of this technology. And this technology is still in the early stages. And so when you start thinking about, well, how do I ensure that it has these things? Well, I think it's the communities that care about it and are encouraging their kids to go into this field and thinking critically about what are the limitations of these systems and thinking about how do we begin to address those limitations. I think that's how we really, sort of move this field forward and bring everybody into the space.
I'll just add from a governance and policy perspective, much of the corporations and post-secondary are just extending their digital policies into the AI space. And so that is beneficial for just a just-in-time solution, but it's challenging in terms of nobody actually really knows the capacity and where the future lies with AI. And so things like IP, intellectual property, what is that? If students at your university or mine are creating information by using generative AI, whose is it? What does it look like? And so there's a lot of questions around policy implementation and intellectual property. Also the idea, the notion of creativity. So if you go into Midjourney and you say to it, so I did this just with my partner the other day, we have a Cocker Spaniel, and so we pictured Samuel sitting at a bar with a ounce of scotch and one ice cube in it, and he's got a fedora on, and things like that. So I put that in, and it popped out a picture, and I sent it to him. Well, that whole dog persona, like, do you guys remember the picture with the dog sitting around playing poker and things like that? That wasn't mine. I didn't create it. I created a prompt to pull out some of that imagery. So what is that, and who does it belong to, and who did we take it from, per se? And that's really essentially one of the things, as all of us become creators and become creative, that we need to think about as we sit back and we call it attribution to the people that would have contributed to that. So it's on our onus to do a little bit of research as to where these rooted elements could have come from, whether it's music or the arts or whatever it is, because again, these algorithms are just pulling and patterning based on what exactly exists, right?
Before we open up for some audience questions, and I do have many more, but I'm going to keep this brief. I want to see if we can make this transition to the audience with a nice kind of call to action for those here in the room or listening in. For those who may be beginning like an AI journey, personally or professionally, or a combination thereof, what are some practical tools, websites, software, things that you would recommend to get started, particularly for those without a technical background, but are still basically, ideally tuning in and saying, hey, this is something, I better figure out how to integrate this into my life, right? How do they actually do that? What would you recommend as like some initial starting points?
I'll start this time. So for the post-secondary students, this is going to be a little bit of a double-edged response. So you go to post-secondary to learn, to build a craft, and to be able to go into the world and apply that craft, right? There's things that will make your craft easier, so you need to think about what is the information and workflow that you could synthesize that you don't lose your own fundamental knowledge about. And then what are the areas that you actually have to learn and develop? So things like metaphorical understanding and representation, well, use tools like Midjourney, and Copilot actually is a really good image developer as well. Like all of them are evolving at the light speed, right? The other piece of that is if you're doing research, then, you know, when you get bogged down in doing citations and things like that, there are tools out there like Research AI and others, Excite, things like that, where you can just get it to curate information off of multiple databases in order for you to gather that. However, it's incumbent upon you to check whether those citations and that research is actually accurate and exists. They will give you a DOI, which is the tag to click to the link to the journal, and it's actually phony or wrong. And so you have to double check all of that information. So the one thing I will say to you, because I do work with PhD students and like bachelor students in research and things like that, is there's a time and place for these tools. It isn't the panacea of everything, and there is something to be said about the learning process and just being curious and love learning that helps you as an individual regardless of what age or stage you're at in life and where you're going. And then there's the idea of how you can curve time. And when you're curving time, that might mean pulling together a bunch of information, making broad scale thematic reasoning. And ChatGPT, you know, Bard, all of these large language models that exist and GPTs, you just need to take a look at what they do and why they do it and consider what you need to get done in that way. But remember, with large language models, it really is data and it's information synthesis. And so again, not that you don't need to check that synthesis, but that's where your quick workflow will become more productive. And you see that in industry all the time. The law field, when we used to give paralegals hours and hours of billable time for them to research files, now you can do it in milliseconds, to be honest with you. So much of that sort of data gathering and research can be curbed through these types of tools.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is in terms of where to start, I would say just get one of these accounts, whether it's a ChatGPT or Gemini or Anthropic or whatever. It doesn't matter which one you start with. Start somewhere. Next, I would suggest taking a prompt engineering course to understand how to really prompt these models for the right things, and just go through that ability of prompting. Once you're comfortable generating prompts that help, I would then think about specific tools for your chosen field. So there's specific tools that have been built on top of LLMs for marketing, for generating presentations for a number of different fields. I wouldn't go into those just yet, right? I would start with just playing around with the general models to understand how they work, and then go into tool specific for a task that you're looking to do. And I think at that point you'll start to see some of the limitations and value that AI has, right? And so as you use it, be very careful and be very critical in terms of examining whether or not the outputs are right or wrong, and don't just fully rely on it.
Mhm.
And then I think as you begin to use it more, you'll start to find avenues where you can improve your skills in certain areas, but also know the limitations of this technology.
And I think on a practical note, like as an example, I think um, like let's say ChatGPT can be great to help you organize your thinking, but not do the thinking for you. So if you're building a program or writing an essay, it can be exceptional as an assistant to help you create a skeleton, an outline, right? But every element of it, it's not really thinking for you. So as an example, I might use it for our programs to build an outline for a program that I want to build. And I might just populate like some initial data for the prompts. But then if I don't actually screen through it, or if I do screen through it, I'll see like obvious errors in very basic things like somebody's title, the ambassador, to X country, it can be completely wrong, and it might say the ambassador to Miami, for example, right? Because I've inputted that this program will take place in Miami, and we will host an ambassador, for example, right? Yeah. That's a very obvious thing. It just shows that there's not like a critical thinking going on. It's just putting together data, basically, right? Yeah. So that's very helpful for the structure and the outline of the program, or an essay or a report. But it's not actually doing critical thinking for you in that sense, right? So
I'll just add one thing to it. There's a framework called AIAS. Yeah. And so what it does is it says to you, how do you want to use it? So it'll say ideation or brainstorming. Then it'll say writing content. Then it'll say evaluating content. And it'll say bringing all of these together. You need to think about where you want to that. Most people, ideation or brainstorming is the best way to use LLMs, to be honest with you. Checking content maybe not as helpful, to be fair. And then majority of post-secondary students, they use it for editing and evaluation of their content, because you have things like, any of those editors that exist, that the names evade me right now, but those are the types of things that really do help, like Grammarly and Quillbot and things like it just came to me. But yes.
And so, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the last thing I will add too is, as you're evaluating these agents or these LLMs, there's a lot of website or a lot of content online of things that you could try to see how they break down too, right? So like recently, somebody posted about, hey, I asked ChatGPT to generate a picture of me based on what it knows about me, right? And so I was like, okay, let me see how that looks. So I asked it to generate a picture of me, and it shows a middle-aged Asian guy.
Perfect.
I'm
Perfect.
like, right? I'm like, so and these things help you to kind of level set your expectations. So I asked her, I said, well, why did you generate this image? He said, well, given what you do and where you are, these are the in my data set. These are the most likely people who do these kind of things, and therefore that's how I generated that. And I think doing those kind of things and just trying those different prompts that people have tried and seen failure also gives you that sense that, okay, this thing is not a panacea. It does break down at some point. So you sort of keep that in the back of your mind as you use this technology.
So congratulations on living the life that is statistically lived by a middle-aged Asian man.
That's so sad. Yeah.
Last thing before we pivot to the audience, just because you mentioned it, you said your recommendation would be to start taking some prompt engineering courses. Do you have any that you might recommend?
Go
ahead. So Google does have quite a few, and Coursera has quite a few really quick ones that are free. And if you do them in less than 3 months worth, you actually can do them for free and not pay the full value of it. They're very exceptional. Google does a ton of course writing seminars and things like that so that you can invest in that, and you get a certificate that actually in LinkedIn most corporations will value as a level 1, level 2, level 3. And then I will do a pitch here just for our university. We are one of the first universities, we're from Canada, where we created a master's program for generative AI for students to engage from industry, designers, and education. And I think many will follow suit. I actually think before we created our master's program, Stanford had a master's program as well, but it's not fully in the generative AI space. So any sort of educational opportunities that you can take, that you can kind of look at immersing yourself in it, and working with what does the tools look like, how can we respond to it, and what are some of the ways in which we can engage. I think that just makes us better. And I will just say one last thing really quickly. As a human being who really does need to take charge of these engagements, stay curious and focus on lifelong learning, because that will never go wrong or steer you wrong. in this era, regardless of what machines and technology exist.
Amen.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any questions from anybody here? Otherwise, I have one or two we can go to. Yes, Michaela. Yeah.
Yeah, question. First of all, thank you guys so much for coming. I think this talk. Oh, thank you. Test. Thank you guys so much for coming. This talk was really enlightening for me. My name is Michaela. I'm a third year here at FIU, studying international relations and Asian studies on the Chinese track, which I know is not the I guess the shoebox image of someone who would come to an AI event, but I think that this event has made me lose a lot of my skepticism on AI. I was really kind of, I don't want to say afraid, but skeptical about using it. Afraid that I would do something wrong or something unethical. But it really kind of reminded me, I guess, of the way that AI is talked about now is, I feel, the way that computers were talked about when they were becoming more and more popular, to be used as a tool, or oh, would they replace my job, things like this. And I remember growing up that there would be like typing classes in high school or something like that, or I've had classes like where they basically just teach us to use Excel. That's kind of the stats class that I'm taking right now. And so my question for you guys is do you see in the foreseeable future in schools that there be like a required prompt engineering course to graduate or something like that?
I think that's a great question.
Very good question.
I'm going to answer from the K to
Yeah.
12 perspective. It already is happening. So UNESCO has created a student framework, and Europe has done a tremendous job in embracing AI and creating policies around it. And so Forbes also published, I don't even know when it was, maybe 5 months ago, AI competencies that people will need to go into the workforce. And so proactive schools that are very inquiry focused will embrace that as an integrative curriculum into any subject area or domain. Others will try very hard to create a standalone course like typing or Excel or things like that. I'm not judging any of those ways. I think it's just beneficial that people are embracing the technology and seeing where it goes. But AI is here to stay. It certainly does, as we talked about with prompt engineering, result in critical thinking and other sort of deductive reasoning skills that are needed, and that has to be honed. But I will say this, I read an article just very recently from MIT, and they argued that we always talk about critical thinking, but is critical thinking actually being used in the workplace? And that just made me pause and go, yeah, you're absolutely right. And when the majority of jobs are rote, so you're doing tasks over and over again, and you're just getting more efficient at it, maybe not as creative, maybe not as robust in the ways you approach it, that really does flip it on its head, So I think workflow is really part of that conversation and that engagement, but they're already doing it, to answer your question.
Yeah, to add to that, so I'm part of a AI Institute. So the National Science Foundation a few years ago started funding these institutes every year. So every year there's 7 institutes funded over the course of 5 years, and each institute gets $20 million. And so our institute is looking at how do you integrate AI agents into K-12 education. And so many of the things that we're trying to understand is what is the most effective way that AI can help students. But I think broadly, yes, having a prompt engineering or intro to AI is going to be very critical, because I think that's just something that people are going to need a lot more of, and it's just the world that we're moving in. So you don't want your students to be at a disadvantage because they don't know how to use the technology.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yeah.
Good evening. I would like to start with thanking you all for such a impactful conversation. My name is Jonathan Davis, and I'm here representing the Miami-Dade County International Trade Consortium, and I'm also a FIU student in my 3rd year studying international business. So my question is on the global perspectives of AI. So how do differing cultural values and also, as you mentioned, socioeconomic stances shape the global approaches to AI and its regulations? So, for example, my office works very closely with Africa and the Caribbean, and I've been in many conversations, way more than I would like, where the skeptical views on AI superseded all of the views where
AI has been seen as a positive resource.
Mm.
So also, how close do you think we are to universally establishing AI's credibility?
So the skepticism was on, like, let's say the delegation side from different countries, or
Yeah.
okay.
So like the more traditional and developing countries, we've had like we our job is basically to welcome delegations who want to do business in Miami-Dade County, and one of our main concerns from visiting delegations has been AI and governments and policy and international trade, and we've gotten several concerns on its implementation. So that was my question.
Can I start with
Of
the
course.
trade question and just policy, I guess, in general? So one of the biggest and rightfully so areas of skepticism is that the models are trained on data that is littered with bias, and data that is very traditionally from the individuals that have the infrastructure to create data. Let me give you an example. So I was at an MIT hackathon and was a judge. And the whole point of the hackathon was to look at baseline medical data and the implications of that. So baseline medical data that is usually drawn from Aryan lineage and does not apply to people like me who are South Asian and Caribbean, other populations, et cetera. So I think what people are reticent about is just that the data does not have a global landscape to it, and it reinforces biases and other implications to it, which I think we do have to be fair in some of that. And the other piece of this is that there are human nature, there's just a lack of trust in new innovative technologies, and you can see this in any diffusion of technology models. Anything like the TI calculator that came in to do algebra and cosine tan, things like that. There was always a hesitation in what is the technology, what is it replacing, so on and so forth. So that should be fair from a humanist perspective. The piece of it that is difficult at the rate of advancement that AI is having on the world, and just in specific fields like education, is that it just can't be predicted. And so there's that sort of idea around, if we're building, most corporations and entities will build an infrastructure around technology. Well, you can't do that if you don't know where the base evolution lies. Does that make sense? So that's part of it, and then I'll turn it to you.
Yeah. So about 2 months ago, I was in D.C. and we had a delegation from Osun State in Nigeria, and I did a presentation on all the wonderful things that AI can do. And one of the things that they said to me was like, it's not that we get the value of AI, but the challenge is we have people who have to feed their family. If we bring on all this automation, what are they going to do? And what type of world is that going to create? Because now they can't work, crime is going to go up. And I think those are the things. So them being skeptical, I think, is a good thing, right? Because I think historically, certain parts of the world has adopted technology in some case without fully understanding what it is. So I think that skepticism is letting me know that they're thinking a little bit deeper about their constituents. So that's good. I think one of the other things we have to be mindful of is how we talk about and what we see as AI. Because when you look at what's happening with these large language models, is analogous to what happened in physics. So prior to a certain point, anybody could do physics experiment at home. So you think about when people like Paul and Marie Curie won the Nobel Prize in physics, it was experiments they did at home. But nowadays, most of the physics experiments are done in these massive institutions that no small country can even afford to stand up. And so I think when you start to see what's happening, you have OpenAI, you have Google, you have a few other big companies that are releasing these models that we're all using. Well, AI doesn't have to go that way. There's smaller models that we can still leverage to have much impact that may be developed by smaller teams, right? And so I think we have to be mindful of, the narrative and how we're sort of guiding the technology and be upfront about, what exactly we're doing. So rather than saying, oh, hey, we need these large language models to be able to do good AI, it's to say, no, this is the approach we're taking because we have good data. Right, and I think if these countries can better understand, and like you mentioned, that AI literacy, then they can better figure out what aspect of it or what approach makes most sense for their use case.
I also think that there's a concern or skepticism from, like, let's say, a developing country perspective, could also reflect anxiety over global power imbalance, right? So if you think about how the world today is dominated by nuclear powers and the power they have, and non-nuclear powers, right? There is an anxiety amongst many countries that, given big countries like the United States, China, blocs like the European Union, other countries like Russia, their ability to leverage not just data, but large amounts of money to invest in the infrastructure needed to have very competitive AI regimes and systems. If you're thinking about systems that are going to be able to outperform humans in financial markets, in military strategy, like, what does that mean for a country that isn't able to leverage that competitively? Imagine the anxiety that can create, right? So those are tough questions, and unfortunately we've run out of time. But like that's a big, like, we could have a whole panel on just that.
Yeah.
And indeed there are panels on just that, and they're really interesting. So it's a really good question, and I think that there's a lot of reasons for that anxiety. It doesn't mean AI is bad. It doesn't mean we shouldn't leverage it in our lives.
Sure.
It just means that there are big topics in international affairs also that we haven't yet figured out the answer to. So with that, I'm going to just hand it over to Leland, but first just thank our panelists here and all of you guys for joining, and all of you for listening in. It's been a pleasure. My name is Aaron Rosen with the World Affairs Council, and it's a pleasure to support the Fulbright Association and to moderate today's conversation. I really enjoyed it. Super interesting. I definitely learned a lot as well, and I hope everybody tuning in and also here in the room did too. Leland, thank you very much. Pass it over to you.
Well, Nadia, Emmanuel, Aaron, thank you so much for an incredible conversation about how we can leverage AI on a day-to-day, but also the future of AI and its geopolitical implications. So thank you so much. Another round of applause. So my name is Leland Lazarus. I'm the vice chair of the National Fulbright Association. We represent, again, 140,000 U.S. alumni around the country and 400,000 Fulbright alumni around the world, and also 54 chapters around the country, of which we have a representative of our local South Florida chapter. So thank you so much. I also want to thank the World Affairs Council of Miami. So Aaron, you've been a partner for many months and years now, and so I've said it before, I'll say it again. I hope that this local collaboration can be a model of which the Fulbright Association and the World Affairs Council of Americas can continue on a national stage. I also want to thank the Florida International University School of International and Public Affairs for hosting us today and for the food. And so please, once we're done with the program, please make sure to, not to waste the food. That would be great. And if you enjoyed this speaker series tonight, we're actually going to be having our Fulbright annual conference right here at FIU, October 24th to the 26th. And so we expect to have hundreds of Fulbright alumni from around the world, 160 different countries coming right here to the FIU School of International and Public Affairs in order to unite. The theme is going to be United We Stand. It is not an understatement to say that, international exchange as we know it is under pressure. And so it's basically a call to action for not just Fulbrighters, but also all like-minded organizations committed to international affairs to come together in support of what we do. So open invitation for everybody. And thank you all so much for the time. And I hope that you have a great rest of your evening. Take care.